This is Effective Speaking, COM125, and this is our unit on storytelling. We're going to start with what is a StorySLAM. Your assignment in this unit is to tell a true story in about 5 minutes, and this is based on the standards by a program called the MOTH. It is a podcast. They also have live performances. You may have heard of it. We're going to look at their rules for storytelling in just a minute. Here are pictures. I'll take a moment to point out. This is your professor on the left. That is a writer's showcase event, reading poetry on stage at the Old Brick Theater. Couple years ago, maybe 2018, and the picture on the right is the first time I was ever on stage. I am singing a Roger Miller song there with Country George, who is a blind country western musician who was my mom's boyfriend at the time back in California in the late 70s, and there are some stories I could probably tell from there, but I just thought that would be fun. Part of what we're doing here when we're telling these true stories about ourselves is we're going to reveal something. We're going to share something that maybe you wouldn't share in everyday life. Sometimes it's embarrassing. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. Sometimes it's funny. It can be humiliating, but, in an endearing way. So I thought those pictures were appropriate. So for storytellers at the MOTH, you must tell a true story. We don't know, obviously, what's true and what's not true, but on the honor system, we are expecting this to be a true story from your life. They have themes. We're not going to worry about that for our purposes here in class. A story needs action, and the action must have consequences. What is gained or lost? What is the urgency? What is the conflict? What is the goal? And who or what is blocking it? How did the trip from point A to point B change or shape you? Good storytelling advice right there. This must be your story to tell. So you had to be there. You have to be one of the main characters. Your involvement in the events as they unfold is essential. So this is not journalism. StorySLAM stories should be about 5 minutes long. You get a little bit of a grace period. This is what they don't want. Stand-up routines, repeat stories, so we don't have to worry about that. Obviously, this is your first time. Stereotypes, rants, essays, how-tos, confessions, lectures, fiction, gratuitous anything, right? This is what they do want. They want to be hooked in. Make us care about you, paint the scene, clearly state your fears, desires, the dilemma. Make us invested in the outcome, introduce the conflict. Make us worried for you. Impress us with observations that are uniquely yours. Rope us into the moment when it all goes down. Conclude as a different person. Triumphant, defeated, befuddled, enlightened, changed. So these are good rules. These are some additional guidelines, so we don't want to have any caricatures or explaining a culture that is not your own. So no fake accents or telling us about the customs of a community you don't belong to. Don't make another person's identity, class, gender, race, orientation, body type the punchline or the storyline. This is your story, your struggles. Also, don't use another's identity as a prop or plot point. If you choose to include another person's race, orientation, physical appearance, or able-bodiedness, be sure that it is intrinsic to the story. Don't celebrate unwanted sexual advances. Never use racial slurs or hate speech. No notes or props in general. We're going to be a little bit more flexible on that too, because you guys are students. This is really your first time doing anything like this, probably. So you'll see in the story that I've already posted for you, that is the story I told in Scranton StorySLAM in 2017. I am kind of reading from my notes because I wanted to share a story with you, and because I had to do this preparation for the class also, I didn't have time to rememorize that. I am a memorizer. It's what I do. because I have anxiety, I have ADHD, I can't focus. You can hear how much I struggle just to even do the narration on these slide presentations. And you've seen me in class, so you know. Here is an example of Margot Lightman's award-winning story, Hope. This is a real MOTH StorySLAM story. You can see there's a link here to watch it on YouTube. We can skip that right now, and but it will be on the PowerPoint, so you can go and watch that. I encourage you to watch that. If you Google Scranton StorySLAM, you'll see local people. You'll find videos. They recorded them faithfully at the very beginning. Most recently, the stories have been the big gay StorySLAM here in Scranton. I think some of those were recorded. I'm not sure if they were all recorded, but you'll see the early ones, including a terrible one of me from 2012 before I stopped drinking and I screw up the first line. But you don't have to watch that. Watch whatever you want. Just see an example for sure. So here are some storytelling tips from Margot Lightman. She wrote a book called Long Story Short, The Only Storytelling Guide You Will Ever Need. She stresses authenticity, and I couldn't agree with her more. People will care about your life as long as it relates somehow to their own life. If you keep your story universal, the audience will be on board. Simply refuse to buy into the belief that you are not an interesting person, and don't be afraid to be uncool. More storytelling tips from Margot. Indifference is the enemy of storytelling. If you don't feel strongly about what you are talking about, the audience won't care about it either. So important. And this goes beyond just storytelling to any speech you give. We've talked about this in class. Hint, make a list of things you feel passionately about. Have a visceral reaction to, and find stories inspired by those passions. Here's a quote from the man who wrote this show, Freaks and Geeks. Hopefully you've seen it. It's a good one. In general, don't portray anything that says, I'm too cool and I don't care. Yeah, not a good idea. So here's some fill in the blanks that Margot came up with to help you figure out the things you are passionate about. I get overly excited by... I pretend to care about X, but I really don't. I pretend to care about Y, but I really do. I worry people will find out. So be creative. Avoid obvious answers like weddings, children, the Kardashians. Don't go too far sobbing on stage or yelling at the audience. No one likes being told how to feel either. So you want to be careful not to alienate your audience. They may have different instincts or responses from you. Kind of tell people the details and let them make up their own minds, make their own decisions. So here's some more fill in the blanks if you find these useful. This makes me cry, and the dumber the better, right? This makes me so angry. You want to look for the humor in heightened emotion, like a silly pet peeve. I can't believe the way I once reacted to this. This is how I learned I hated that. This is my biggest strength, and or this is my biggest flaw. I wish I could be more like this, but instead I am more like that. Right, so you get the idea here. These are some things that can spin a whole story off. These stories don't have to be epic, right? We're not looking for the hero's journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about that just because it's good storytelling form and you need to know kind of what those things are. But for StorySLAM stories, they don't have to be huge events in life. They can be just silly stories that give us some insight into human existence, right? Think of a time you snapped or really lost your cool. Now try to find the humor in it. If you can laugh about it, chances are your audience will find it funny too. Your defects are interesting and relatable. Why would we root for you? Name dropping, bragging, and cold, cool hearts are alienating. Be fragile, be broken. So you want to identify who you are as a character. Use your endearing traits to your advantage. Acknowledge anything that is obvious about you right away so as not to distract from your story. You have a broken foot, or if you're pregnant. For these videos, that's not going to matter so much. But that's some good tips for on stage, really. Like, if people are going to be thinking about it when they're looking at you, get it out of the way. I am the type of guy or girl who will do this. I never do this, but I'll always do that, right? Tell a story that proves one of these statements to be true. What are your influences? Movies, books, places, people, things that are important to you. 5 things that describe you, 5 things you want. This will kind of help you figure out who you are as a story character, which is what we're doing here, right? Okay, so Margot's tips for winning stories. Keep it true. Change names and characteristics of others if necessary. Make sure your story has a relatable, universal theme, that it's not self-indulgent or overly personal. Keep it conversational, not presentational. Cut out anything you wouldn't say to a group of friends. You want your story to sound natural. Don't be heavy-handed with your message. Let the story speak for itself. If you're not over it, don't tell it. So, if your mom's in hospice and it's been really painful and she's barely hanging on, it might not be time to tell that story. If you're going to burst into tears in front of the audience, or if you haven't healed from a breakup, you shouldn't be talking about that yet. You have older stories, things you can talk about. The story that I tell you in the example here is a story that I can tell now because it was more than 20 years ago, so it's easy to talk about now that it was so long ago. Tell us what you were thinking at the time of your story. Reveal your inner monologue from A to Z. Cut the fat when introducing external characters. Use composite characters and nickname them when you can. So this is a true story, but if you are at a party with like 12 of your friends, we're not going to be able to keep track of all those characters. You can just kind of, combine some of them if you need to, or really just who are the absolutely essential people in this story? Who do we need to know? And give us some identifying characteristics so that we can kind of keep track of who these people are. We don't know who you're talking about. They're vivid in your memory, but this is the first we're hearing about these people, right? Make sure that we root for you. So be the underdog, be the star of your own story. Keep us on our toes by incorporating the unexpected. Don't go on a political rant or just make a list of things. Get to the meat of your story. If you care, we care. Write the story out exactly the way you would tell it out loud to a group of friends with slang, etc. That's kind of what I do. You'll see when in the recording of me reading the story, it sounds very conversational, even though that it has been written down. And that's how I memorized it, Use your voice and facial expressions to communicate characters' behavior, attitude, mood, etc. Let your delivery show us how you feel in that moment and your opinion about things. The meat of your story should have conflict, build to a climax, then a resolution. Don't tell us the moral of the story, just what happens next. Here's a quote from David Sedaris that I really love. David Sedaris is an acclaimed storyteller. You probably have heard of him. He says, "A good story would take me out of myself, then stuff me back in, outsized now and uneasy with the fit." There's this idea that stories are transformative, that we evolve, that the protagonist, the main character of the story, changes because of the events that happen in the story. And that's why we're telling the story. It's not just what happened, it's how we were changed by these events. So at the end of the story, you probably can't fit back into yourself at the beginning. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about here. You have some personal experience that you can relate to that. How much you know now. Think about it. Like when you were a kid, you couldn't put all of that knowledge and experience that you've gained since childhood into your child self. There is power in nostalgic details. So what music was playing? What were you wearing? What kind of car were you driving? Who are your heroes or role models? What kind of food were you eating? So if I were talking about middle school for me, I might talk about that song Total Eclipse of the Heart or any Air Supply song. Every time I hear them, they remind me of sitting in the orthodontist chair getting work done on my braces, right? I'll never forget what I had on in my 7th and 8th grade pictures. No, this is the 80s. It was terrible. I had like a pale blue polka dot dress. In my 7th grade picture, I had a terrible haircut. In 8th grade, I actually had like a little tail. It was a fashion then. And I had, it was like a black sweatshirt with like a sparkly, glittery tiger on it. It probably would be like really cool now, but in high school I had an 81 Camaro that we called the Bitchin' Camaro after that Dead Milkmen song. So these are some things that you don't just say I was in the car. Like, give us a feel for where we are in time and what kind of world this is. One great idea for coming up with a story is to identify patterns. Full circle stories are great. So things that happen to you over and over again. Do you attract the same kind of people repeatedly? What kind of jobs do you keep getting? Or maybe the jobs change, but the coworker archetypes remain the same. Like every job you go to, there's the same kind of people there. Recall places you have returned to and think about why every time you go to Florida or something. When have you had the thought, why does this keep happening to me? There's a story in that, right? What role do you repeatedly play in your family? Are you the peacekeeper, for example? Have you ever thought, I am turning into my mother or my father? There's something in that. Don't spell it out. Let the full circle be a fun moment for the audience when it all kind of ties together, right? So let's look at traditional story ingredients. Characters, number one. I always start with characters. What are the defining characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses? What is the character flaw of your protagonist? External conflict. What is at stake? There's something that must be dealt with, stopped, avoided, or found. Rising action. So the characters are going to confront or engage with the conflict. There are often several failures before the goal is achieved. Climax, something shocking happens that changes the story dynamics, causes the conclusion of conflict. And the resolution, or denouement, which is a French word, it means wrap up, closure. So we're going to suggest how life will be different going forward for the characters in this new world order. Now, you may not have all of these ingredients in your StorySLAM story, but they're good ingredients as far as traditional stories are concerned. So I wanted to include them here because it's good to understand storytelling in general. And this is kind of my specialty, so I know I kind of go off on a tangent in class, but it's important because even in your more formal or business speeches, having stories in them is so important. And in professional business marketing, storytelling is the thing that people are looking for. It's why I got my job in marketing and communications that I have right now, because I have a background as a storyteller, and they understood that in content marketing, storytelling is really important. Being able to make an emotional connection with people is essential. Here's a plot structure diagram that I'm including just to show you, how key these things are. You've got your characters, the setting, the time, and the place. These are important things. We need to know where we are. We should know with our senses, what does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? All of these things. There's the rising action, the turning point, right? When does everything change? That's a big thing in movies, maybe not so much your StorySLAM story, but it's good to have a turning point, right? When we think we know where the story is going, but then that's not it. It takes another direction. Falling action, the major events that lead to the resolution. Conflict, theme, lesson learned by the protagonist. So these are all good ingredients for your story. Here's 7 plots: Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, Voyage and Return, The Quest, Comedy, Tragedy, Rebirth. So we've got a little more here. When we look at comedy, there's confusion often with misunderstandings or mistaken identities that lead to conflict before a happy conclusion and celebrations. This goes all the way back to the Greeks and Shakespeare. Tragedy, the tragic flaw of a main character, leads him or her to rebel against the rules or norms of society, which sets a series of events in motion that leads to death or downfall. Rebirth, the character is shown the error of their ways and redeems himself. So you're probably thinking of stories right now that fit into these plot lines. Here's 19 plot templates that I got from Darcy Pattison, which I had fun laying out with these graphics that I probably shouldn't have spent money on, but I couldn't resist the fairy tale graphics. I thought they were so cool. Quest, a character-oriented story. The protagonist searches for something and winds up changing him or herself. Adventure, a plot-oriented story. This features a goal-oriented series of events. We've got a pursuit, right? The chase story. It's definitely action-oriented. Rescue, another easy to recognize action-oriented plot, right? Somebody needs to be rescued. Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. Revenge stories. Character comes back in. Someone is wronged and vows to take revenge. Escape story. It's a variation on the rescue when the protagonist escapes on his or her own. The riddle. It's a mystery story, right? An underdog story. Everyone roots for the underdog. This is the plot where the underprivileged triumph despite overwhelming odds. And a rivalry story is another good example. 2 main characters, one on a downward track and one on an upward track, and how they interact. Metamorphosis, a physical transformation of some kind. If you watched the movie District 9, you'll recognize this platform. I haven't seen that, actually. Dracula, Beauty and the Beast, or The Fly, obviously. It's based on Kafka. Temptation. So they mention here Pandora's Box. You could think of the story of Eve and the apple, right? The oldest temptation story of all time. Maturation. So it's a coming of age story. Someone grows up morally, spiritually, or emotionally. Often it's just a hint of growth or a tiny change that hints at larger changes. Love story, the classic boy meets girl plot. Transformation story, similar to the previous one that we were talking about. This is an inner change, right? An emotional change, a character change instead of a physical outer form change. Forbidden love. Twilight here. Romeo and Juliet, obviously, all of those stories. Sacrifice, from the biblical tale of Jesus to the story of parents sacrificing for their children. That's a staple of literature. Discovery, you know those secrets you've buried deep in your past. This story digs around, exposes secrets, and watches them affect the characters. That's often combined with the mystery stories, right? The riddle stories, the puzzles. Wretched excess, when a character is in a downward spiral from alcohol, drugs, greed, etc. This is the plot form. Ascension or descension, so it's a similar idea. A rise or fall from power puts a character into this plot form. So those are all different ideas that might help you think of what kind of story you're going to tell. The hero's journey is a famous Joseph Campbell template for a structure template that is based on his story, Hero with 1,000 Faces. I have a detailed handout that's attached to this. This one is a little bit simpler. So you've got the call to adventure, and then maybe a supernatural aid. There's a guardian at the gate, right? This is the known world. You go through that threshold. This is the beginning of the transformation. You're in the unknown world. There's often a helper character or a mentor. A supernatural character often is the mentor. There are a series of challenges and temptations, which thank God you have a helper. We have here abyss, death and rebirth, revelation. So there's this moment in the story where it may seem like all is lost, or we think that the character has died, but then they are resurrected. Maybe they're given some kind of potion or something, some kind of hope, something that helps them get up and keep going and start again. That's where the transformation comes in, right? When you think that you've given up all hope, when you've surrendered, then you change in this new life that you have. There's atonement, so now you try to make up for your past failings. And then we return into the known world, often with some sort of gift from that we've gotten in that other world. So these are traditional storytelling tropes. Here, this is very much screenplay stuff, but I think it's really good because it kind of breaks down that same hero's journey into what Blake Snyder uses. He's a man who wrote a book called Save the Cat, which is really popular with screen writers, and that's where you see those act breaks. Those have nothing to do with your story, but we see here there's an opening image. The theme is stated. There's setup. These are good things to have even in your StorySLAM story, right? There's an inciting incident or a catalyst. There could be a debate here. Should I go? Should I not go? Then we have the fun and games section. So this is kind of like once you're kind of into the meat of the story, that rising action, there's fun stuff kind of happening. You get to the midpoint, that's often the turning point. In a screenplay, this is where the bad guys close in, right? That all or lost or low point. They also call that the dark night of the soul. That's that moment I was just talking about where, you know, it seems like all is lost and you surrender, and then you get that help that you need to kind of come back, right? It's just, we love that part of the story. And then we have the final confrontation, the aftermath, and then a final image. This is the new world. This is something to let us think that this is how it's going to be from now on. The end. Hopefully that will give you some ideas that you can use to craft your own story. And my example is the first one posted in the discussion where you will post your story. So give that a watch too, and you can see how human I am and how human you are allowed to be. We're not perfect. Just tell the story from your heart. Let us know something that happened to you that, you know, is a memory for you, or that means something to you, and your classmates will certainly respond to it. So thanks a lot. Have fun.